It's a real personal honor for me to be here. I feel like the Architectural League has played a really important and foundational role in the development of our firm's voice. I'll show a couple of projects that have a connection to the League. And I wanted to kind of express my personal, gratitude to Anne and Rosalie and others at the League for really, supporting us as a young architecture firm, an experimental architecture firm, as Paul described. And I also want to mention right away that we really think of the practice of architecture as a kind of team sport. In particular, our recent projects, would not at all be possible without our incredible local team, our team at the Living, including, I want to specifically recognize John Locke and Daniil Nagy and Damon Lau. I think a couple of them are here. But also we have an incredible network of collaborators, both within architecture and in other disciplines. We kind of rely on team efforts to test new things and to try to prototype the architecture of the future. We also think of the process of design itself as a kind of ecosystem of interconnected loops. Multiple dependencies, connections to projects in the past, projects in the future, work by us in the past, work by others in the past. And deliberately thinking of each project, each module of research, as having links to others and designing them in that way. And that's something that started with our early work and carries on to our current work. So I'm going to describe a few different categories and mention a project or two for these categories that we think of as part of our practice of architecture. The first is prototyping, and this idea began with an approach that we developed. It was a kind of method of experimentation that we developed called flash research. So this was types of projects that have self-imposed constraints of a low budget, $1,000 or less, short duration, 3 months or less, but then nevertheless tried to test out a full-scale functioning prototype to experiment with new ideas. The method involves iterative prototyping, so we continually build and test again in this kind of iterative cycle. And you see some of these almost weekly prototypes shown here for one of our projects. And I'm going to give you a sense of some of these early projects just very quickly. The first one began with the idea that architecture might be dynamic. It might respond to us in some way. And this is a diagram of a material called shape memory alloy that contracts along its length when you apply electricity to it. And after a series of different research investigations, we developed this, which we call living glass. It's a thin, transparent membrane, a surface that's connected to some sensors, and it basically breathes in response to various sensors. So in this case, it's connected to a carbon dioxide sensor. Someone can breathe into the surface, breathe into the building envelope, and it breathes back. So it's a kind of exploration of technology, of new types of envelopes, but also an exploration of an idea that our architecture might register something important to us about its conditions and about the environment. A second example, I should mention that in projects like this, we publish not just kind of photographs of the final product, but links so that others can build off of what we've done. And we often publish instruction manuals, which will allow others to take exactly what we've done in about a day, replicate the key features, and then build their own version. And we use this idea in teaching. This is one of our classes at Columbia called Living Architecture, where some students took our instruction manual, this idea of a shape memory alloy that contracts along its length, but obviously built an entirely different project. This is called the Huggy Wall. This is a project that we did that was a kind of scaling up, but still very much a full-scale functioning prototype. And it began with the idea that buildings already have a lot of sensors embedded in them, but they often don't communicate with other buildings. What if buildings could develop a kind of social network, share their sensor data with other buildings, and kind of create an ecosystem of information? We built custom sensors, some custom software that runs on a low-cost laptop, and we kind of expanded our experiment with these breathing building envelopes to explore a future where buildings could take in a variety of sensor data and respond to both local data and remote data. One of our first installations was on the facade of the Empire State Building. You see some of these wireless sensor nodes here. And then we had a kind of prototype of a building skin that is breathing in response to this ecosystem of information. This project led very naturally to another project that dealt with air quality, and this was called Living Light. It's basically a public art project that we turned into an experiment in the future architecture of this city. We started with the idea, or not the idea, but the condition of Seoul as a city, like many cities, where the air quality fluctuates vastly from day to day. Here you see a picture on the top and the bottom from the same vantage point, but obviously different levels of air contamination. Seoul already has a couple of really advanced real-time interfaces to air quality. On the left, you see a digital billboard displaying PM10, an important contaminant in the air, real-time, what the reading is. And there are also some really good websites which do things like show the map of Seoul, shown here, and which neighborhoods have which air quality levels in real time. Seoul also has, as you probably know, and like many other cities, an increasing amount of building facades that are dynamic through dynamic LED lights. And we thought that maybe we could combine these two, combine real-time information about the environment with a dynamic building facade to create a different kind of building facade of the future. So we started with the map of the city, divided into the major neighborhoods of the city. We located about 27 sensors, high-quality air sensors run by the government. We redrew the map according to the spaces closest to those sensors. So instead of showing the political boundaries here, we're showing the kind of air boundaries for each sensor, a different way to look at the neighborhoods of the city. And then we took that map of the city and kind of made it into a building facade, a canopy in the shape of the map of Seoul that would be constructed in a park, a public park, as a permanent pavilion. And then we used a series of different kind of technologies like we often do in our projects, but kind of in the service of executing the big idea of the project, which was to create a real-time interface to air quality. And basically, what we put into the city, into a public space in the city, is a building facade or a pavilion that glows and blinks according to two main factors: information about air quality in the city and public interest in the environment. And it works in kind of three ways. First, it's a display of air quality improvement. So neighborhoods, you remember each panel is a neighborhood in the city, and neighborhoods light up if their air quality right now is better than a year ago. So it's a display of which neighborhoods are improving in air quality, a kind of low-resolution filtered way of displaying that information. Second, every hour the whole map goes dark and the neighborhoods illuminate in order of best air quality to worst. So in this case, it's, again, a low-resolution type of information, but here it's displaying comparison between neighborhoods in real time. The first way is a comparison between a single neighborhood and what it was before. Third, and maybe most important and interesting for us, is that it was a display of public interest in the environment. So we created a custom hotline where you could send a text message with a zip code or a postal code requesting information about the air quality. That neighborhood would then blink twice, as you see here, and then the person on their cell phone gets back the real-time air quality. But what we think is most interesting is the blinking twice, because what we're taking is a kind of personal level of communication on the cell phone and combining that with a kind of collective type of information. So if you look at this glowing pavilion and you see a lot of blinking, you know that collectively we're really interested in finding out about air quality at that moment. If one neighborhood blinks more than another, then we know that there's more interest in that neighborhood. So it takes our kind of collective concerns, our collective interest, and puts them on display in a building facade. This pavilion it's now constructed. It's a permanent part of this park in Seoul. It has a certain kind of life, along with the park and along with this public space. Here's a food delivery man texting the pavilion to find out the air quality. It's a kind of tangible object. People like to touch it. But it's also this important register of this kind of intangible but important thing, air quality. So 2, design with environment. This is a project that really got its life and got its start from the Architectural League. We owe a lot of thanks to them. It was part of an incredible exhibition supported by the League called The Sentient City, Toward the Sentient City. And in our case, our project for this exhibition involved putting sensors and ubiquitous computing and the Internet of Things out into the water, a place where typically there's not a lot of digital information. And what it consisted of for us was a network of floating tubes that are half underwater and half above water. Underwater, there's an array of sensors. Above water, there's an array of dynamic lights. And this basically allows us to create the same kind of environmental interface described in the project in Seoul, Korea, but this case with water quality and with some additional layers of information. It includes a text message interface, and it's kind of having a conversation with other lights of the city and other lights and light patterns in the water of the city. This is just south of Pier 35 in Manhattan in the East River, and right next to where the Manhattan Bridge comes into Manhattan. It's also kind of connected to the industrial landscape of the city. And we think it creates an interesting counterpoint to some other dynamic lights in the city. For example, this tower in green, which I'm sure everyone knows, which changes color, like our system, but it changes color about once a day, usually. It displays information like holidays or sponsorships of concerts or sports teams. And our dynamic layer of lights in the city, kind of in counterpoint, changes more than once a second. It displays air quality, presence of fish, and public interest in the environment. And it shows that, that even the surface of the water could be thought of as a kind of building envelope of the city. This gives you a sense of kind of the interactivity of the project. This is building the prototype, where you see some of these dynamic lights testing out the functionality, glowing and blinking according to kind of personal requests of information, but also data being collected from the environment. Here we're staging to install it. The lights change colors as well as blink on and off. And there are 2 layers of lights, a top layer and a bottom layer. The installation also has a kind of rhythm as it floats, which allows us to create a kind of sensor, not a digital sensor, but a kind of physical sensor for the flow of water in the city. And here's an important moment where we see the lights changing colors, and this again means something important for the life of the city. In this case, it means that it was a kind of tipping point from the water quality being worse now than last week to better now than last week. One thing we've been exploring in this kind of way that I hope is showing how our projects try to build on themselves is we're doing a second installation of this project now with the city as the client, the EDC. And this will be a more or less permanent floating pier of these tubes of lights that will display water quality, have a larger presence in the city. But in addition, this time we're exploring another layer of input, and that is using living organisms as sensors. So the first round, we're using digital sensors to sense dissolved oxygen. In this case, we're using live mussels because it turns out that the rate and amount that mussels open their shells is a very sensitive detector of pollution in the water. So if we can attach a magnet to one side of a mussel and a very low-cost sensor of magnetic force to the other side, then we can detect when these mussels are opening and closing and how much, and use the mussel as a way of giving us the same kind of information that we had been collecting digitally before. We prototyped this at the Venice Biennale a couple of years ago. It was basically a way of taking further our explorations of environment, living systems, biology, information, and technology. Our partner in this project is the incredible artist Natalie Jarmojenko. Here she's putting our mussel sock into the canals in Venice. Kind of in the spirit of this type of research with information technology, the life of the city, I wanted to show this project really quickly to show something about how the projects like to take their site into account. So this is a project called Street Life. It's for the Hong Kong Shenzhen Biennale a couple years ago also. And it started with two factors of these cities that we were really interested in. One is street food, incredible culture of street food in Shenzhen and Hong Kong, and also the manufacture of electronics, which we all know is important to that region. And we wanted to combine them both by basically creating a custom soup bowl with embedded information and electronics. Even though we were just using very cheap soup bowls that are used in these street food vendors, we used a little bit of digital fabrication in a kind of unusual way, carving into the bottom of these soup bowls. We used very simple digital technology of lighting, which are these scrolling LED messages. And this was all in service. And this is how you can basically hack into these scrolling LED messages and program your own messages, which we invited the curators of the Biennale to do. Here's one of the messages. And then basically this was in service of creating a kind of layer of communication in the city that could engage the public with elements of surprise, wonder, and humor. So we developed partnerships with a series of different dai pai dongs. These are these local street food vendors. People are very curious about these bowls. The municipal officials, instead of confiscating them, wanted to show them to their friends. We had to bring them back and get them for ourselves. And this is the kind of street food vendor that we partnered with, and this is kind of what it looks like in action. So these are the normal bowls that they normally use, but hidden inside was this kind of secret. The bowls looked, from outer appearances to be normal soup bowls. Food was served in them. but then we get this kind of surprise at the bottom of the bowl, which I'll show in a second. But this is the kind of message that kind of brought the thinking of this International Biennale out into the streets, brought it out of the venues of civic centers and galleries into the streets of the city through this strange level of exchange, these provocations written by the curators about the life of the city that were then delivered to unsuspecting citizens in the bottom of their food. And actually, as one of the many materials that we like to test, the broth of the soup was very important in its ability to kind of hide the message, but kind of let it show through even before all the food was gone. Okay. And so hopefully, you kind of see some of these projects building on one another, and I have just a couple more to show, which are kind of leading us to some of our latest explorations. This is a project where we had been thinking very much about how it may no longer be sufficient for architects and other designers to think of single solitary objects or single solitary buildings without considering all of their interdependencies, both across space, of course, which already happens with almost every good building, its consideration of context, but also across time, its relation to history, its relation to where the materials came from before they made it into the building and where they will go afterwards. And its relation to a broader kind of ecosystem of use. For example, as everyone knows, the day a building opens, it's no longer a design project for the architect. It becomes part of a different type of life and is a little bit beyond the control of the designer. These were some of the thoughts in our minds when we did this short installation. So it started again with the material effect. This is the effect of honey dropping from a spoon back into a jar. It has this kind of coiling effect because of the viscosity of the liquid. And all viscous liquids behave in this way. And you can see here how if you drop a viscous liquid, in this case melted plastic, onto a conveyor belt, and the conveyor belt is moving pretty fast, you get a straight line. If the conveyor belt is moving slower, you get a kind of wavy line. And if the conveyor belt is moving even slower, you get much more complex patterns like loops, like figure eights, much like sewing machine patterns, actually. We were very interested in this material effect as one of the things we were exploring. And we were also interested in combining different types of materials with different rules. So we had this synthetic material, the plastic that layered on itself, and we also created a system to suspend a natural material, in this case liquid moss, in some tubes and be able to spray them out into the same general space as the plastic. So we have this ecosystem of natural material, moss, competing with the synthetic material, plastic, in a kind of interaction that could be cooperative or competitive, that had rules and relationships and complexities like all ecosystems. In each case, the way that plastic aggregates is controlled by one variable. The way that the moss aggregates is controlled by one variable. For plastic, it's the rate at which this conveyor belt or rotating disc goes around. And for the moss, it's basically how often you spray it. And both of these variables were controlled by this third part of the ecosystem that we thought was important, and we called it a kind of material of ideas. So a natural material, a synthetic material, and a material of ideas. The material of ideas basically means we were logging real-time web searches in this city for terms like future, environment, and construction. And when those levels changed, it would change the rate of the disk rotating and the amount of spraying moss. So it's basically our way of saying, in a very simple way, we're going to set up this set of rules and relationships, and then the key being we're going to let it play out for 30 days with no intervention. So it's a very precise design of the rules and a very open-ended design of the form. We created this kind of contraption in order to play it out, this rotating disc, a system of melting recycled plastic pellets into this viscous liquid, calibrated things so that we could get basically the building, automated building of a kind of wall, a kind of module of architecture through this ecosystem, through this system. And in a way, it was informed by some of our thinking about digital fabrication in architecture, which tends to be top-down, very obsessed with precision, but you can also have digital fabrication, meaning fabrication controlled by machines, that's more open-ended, that's not so top-down, where the results have some kind of feedback cycles. And this is what we got. This is about half of the 30 days of the exhibition. And you see over time a kind of aggregation of a wall, a building up through this ecosystem, an equilibrium. But then at a certain point, for a variety of reasons, including some changes in data in real-time web searches, we had a kind of a breakdown of the system, or a moment of chaos, a tipping point. But then, like in many ecosystems, there was a new equilibrium that developed, a more complex equilibrium, in some ways a messier equilibrium. But it was basically now a system that, instead of building a more pristine cylinder, built this kind of woven structure of bands that continued to aggregate. And really, the fascination here was exploring how we might learn from this project in order to be better prepared to design with uncertainty, design with rules and relationships rather than fixed forms. And in many ways, even though this was a couple years before Hurricane Sandy, we think this kind of thinking is permeating a lot of the really interesting thinking around post-Hurricane Sandy resilience and anti-fragility, and how we might design more natural systems and systems that are designed to respond to change. Almost last, I want to describe really quickly a project that shows some of our latest work in translating these concepts of being informed by biological systems, creating kind of adaptive systems, how we've translated some of that with some of our technology research partners, including a great group at Autodesk, the office of the CTO there, who we're working with to design new kind of workflows that will allow new types of design. I'm going to describe this project very quickly through a video. And basically, this is a framework that we're working on where we think, just like in the project I just described about ecosystems, we think there might be a new way of designing, without the typical obsession of control. So in this project, we have a series of steps that we think could apply to many different projects, but I'll show one example. And it's basically to say, take a chair, for example. The typical process might be you kind of sketch the stick figure of the chair and then gradually figure out how to build it in more complexity. But here we're saying, what if you just sketch some aspects that you know how to build, like the seat, but then sketch a kind of boundary of possibilities for another aspect and design some rules that will let you explore a bunch of design possibilities and use the power of computation and algorithms to achieve new results that are beyond the capacity of kind of typical human linear thinking and that kind of get us out of our normal assumptions. So without going into the details, we basically created a system where the computer will, following our rule set, generate a series of points, interconnect them through a bunch of small bars into a lattice, And we can create many, many possible configurations of this. For each configuration, we get a geometric model. We can simulate it. We can test it for its performance structurally and otherwise. So for every design, we get a score for structure, a score for how much material is used. But this process could also involve scores for environmental impact or other things. We're working with a new web-based and cloud computing-based platform that we're developing with Autodesk called Project Cyborg. And this is just kind of showing it in action. But more or less, it's just to say this allows us to automatically generate, evaluate, and evolve a wide variety of possible designs. And here you see the data representation, not the physical representation, to show that we can very quickly, through the process of the computer, the power of the computer, generate tens of thousands of designs or even millions of designs. Use some of the latest techniques of data visualization to sort through those designs, to select and filter designs, and basically create a new type of design, which is not to say the computer is replacing the human creativity, but ideally the computer could be extending the human creativity through things that the computer can do that allow us to make designs that we wouldn't otherwise be able to create. In this case, all of the design rules were very much configured to go all the way from a stick figure sketch to a 3D printed full-scale model. And here we see some of those steps happening, getting higher and higher resolution, and eventually resulting in, fairly directly in a physical object. And, like some of our early projects, a test of an idea as a physical object. One of the things we think this means for the future is that we can go from traditional design of kind of solid bars or, typical existing materials to smart design, which are aided by new technologies like 3D printing. So you can replace the solid legs with legs of tiny lattice, uniform lattice designed by a human. But the ultimate step is creating designs that a human alone could never possibly create and that can be manufactured through this new technology of 3D printing. So we think this type of encapsulating some of the behavior of adaptive biological living systems into computation is a really exciting direction. And finally, I just want to show the last project, which, although it's a work in progress, we wanted to show, because it's kind of fitting of our method, that we see every project as pretty much never finished, but connecting to future projects. And I'll just quickly describe this one, but it's called Hi-Fi, and this was our proposal for the MoMA PS1 summer courtyard installation. The idea basically was that we could create a kind of fun space for the events at MoMA PS1 in the summer, but also at the same time explore a new paradigm for design and manufacturing. And it started, in a way to come full circle, with the Earth's natural carbon cycle, the system of growth and decay and regrowth and renewal. And as everyone knows, the way that we typically make buildings is somewhat wasteful in the context of the carbon cycle. We take, raw materials, and there's this kind of one-way trajectory through production, construction, and demolition into a landfill, typically. Of course, there's been great progress in reusing building materials, so kind of recycling materials and redirecting from the landfill back into production, so taking the waste from one building and putting it into the production of another building. But we also thought there could be this deeper level of exploration of these cycles by saying, what if we just take the carbon cycle and temporarily redirect the physical resources and energy resources into a building and then return that raw material back into the soil? No real acknowledgement that there's any place for materials other than back into the ecosystem. And could we really make buildings like that? We wanted to explore those ideas in this project. And so a couple of different ecosystems at play here. One, and probably most importantly, is a material ecosystem. So I'll go through this quickly, but this is basically the idea that we can create a new type of brick through a process of growing bricks, then eventually constructing a building out of them, then returning these bricks back to the earth through composting. The way it works is you need a tray to grow the bricks in. We're using trays made of a kind of high-tech material, but that will eventually make it into the building and then back into an ecosystem of material research. It's basically a new material invented by 3M, which is a mirror that is plastic-based, so it can be formed in any form. So we're forming the molds for our bricks out of this mirror material. Collaborating with 3M. We're collaborating with this great company called Ecovative to create these organic bricks. And it starts with agricultural waste, in this case, chopped up corn husks. These are put into growing trays and then combined with a mushroom root structure, so a living organism, that will grow with this agricultural waste and fuse it into solid objects. Here you see a time lapse of that happening over just about 5 days with no additional energy and no waste and no carbon emissions. You get these solid objects, which we're going to create as bricks. So you get a building material with almost no waste, almost no energy, and almost no carbon emissions. This is an incredible startup company called Ecovative. They're in upstate New York, and they've really mastered this technology and industrialized it so they can produce 10,000 bricks for us for this project. And what we get at the end of the day is this brick that's lightweight, low cost, and it doesn't use non-renewable resources. Something interesting to note is in a discussion about food and biofuel, there's often this argument of whether we should use agriculture or these living systems, plants, for food, or whether we should use them for things like fuel or plastics. Our process here sidesteps that because we're not using corn kernels, which are used for most biofuels. We're using agricultural waste, corn stalks, a very low-value agricultural product that no one would want, and kind of recycling it into building blocks, into objects, and then returning it back to the earth after it's done. Continuing our process of collaboration, we're working with a couple of great artists who are experts at natural dyes. So we're taking advantage of this natural material to dye it and give it a color. We're using a organic compostable mortar. So this is literally a brick and mortar structure, but it's entirely compostable. And we're building this into a structure that both creates an interesting new environment, we think, for the courtyard of PS1, but also kind of puts to the test our idea about a building system by saying, could we make a serious, viable structure out of this at a scale that would signal, what's possible with the architecture of the future? We get a structure that looks like this. Here we're using the organic bricks on the bottom. We're taking the growing trays, which you remember was this reflective material. We're putting them on the top. This allows us to do a couple things, create interesting lighting effects, but also help create a stack effect and a natural kind of cooler microclimate in the courtyard. We have porosity at the bottom of the structure and density at the top, kind of inverting the typical logic of bricks, which would normally be denser at the bottom and lighter at the top. We're using some techniques of computation again to create this system where we build up bricks with a lot of porosity, check and test for structural performance. If it's not right, go back to the level that was previously correct and keep building up again. So it's a very kind of low-tech, ancient technology of bricks and organic material, but also using the best of our kind of high-tech design techniques. We have some daylighting effects through reflected light into the structure. We have interesting views, insulating from sound, working with another collaborator, great collaborator, Atelier 10, to create this microclimate through the stack effect of a cool space within the hot courtyard of PS1. Basically figuring out where to place everything on the site and with the reflective bricks, and basically creating something that we think can have an interesting effect of lighting and color and spatial experience, but that can also represent a new paradigm for design, especially in the context of our existing design, both typical brick structures like PS1 and glass and steel structures like those of Manhattan behind. We're engaging an ecosystem of materials that we think is interesting in part because it's local. We get all of the raw materials and the manufacturing and the construction of the building and a return to composting all within a 150-mile radius, kind of like the local food movement. We have a great partner, Build It Green, who's going to take all of our building materials, compost them, then return them to community gardens and tree planting. And we create a building with no waste, no energy, no carbon, approximately, and adding value of manufacturing, jobs, economy. And I want to end just by showing how we think that this project kind of comes from a bigger research agenda and returns to a larger vision for the future of architecture. Thank you.